In November 1997, the first chill of winter slipped through the cracks of the old records storage room at the Delaware State Police headquarters, a few miles north of Milford. Investigator Raymond Holt's flashlight cut through the thin layer of dust, landing on rows of time-yellowed file boxes. "Central, I need a forensic technician down here. We just found something that could change the entire case." Holt's voice echoed in the empty room, mingling with the tick-tack-tick of the ancient heater. What had been considered a hopeless cold case was now showing the first signs of movement, and it was about to answer the question that had haunted Milford for more than 3 decades. Among the forgotten paperwork, Holt discovered a sealed envelope from inside were items that once seemed meaningless: a mud-stained piece of car carpet, cigarette butts, and the shaky handwritten note of an 8-year-old girl. Those tiny objects had been overlooked decades earlier, but now, under the new light of forensic DNA, they opened a door straight back to the night Mary Ellen Weaver vanished from her bedroom. For years the case had been Delaware's silent wound, a child taken from her bed, found in a marsh with horrific injuries, and a killer who melted into the dark. That year's search had dragged on for weeks, but yielded only tire tracks, beer cans, and a vague description of a man who smelled like cigarette smoke. There were no further leads. When the trail went cold, the file was boxed up with a short note: "Insufficient evidence." Milford went on living as if that night had never happened. But the silence didn't last forever. A DNA hit from that sealed envelope turned everything upside down. The discovery didn't just resurrect a child assault case. It was the first domino in a chain of secrets Delaware thought were buried for good. Secrets of violence, indifference, and decades of suspended justice. And when Holt finally tracked down the real suspect, it wasn't some stranger from far away. It was someone who had lived right in the heart of Milford, went to work every day like everyone else, and was considered so ordinary he was beyond suspicion. The Mary Ellen Weaver case isn't just a mystery dug up from the past. It's proof of the persistence of generations of investigators, of the power of forensics to give voice to a silenced child, and of the truth that justice, even when delayed, still finds its way to the right person. It's also the story of a community torn open by the truth, a place where silence once shielded crime, and where the light finally forced everyone to face the past. Where in America are you watching this story from? Drop your location in the comments. Tonight we're going back to that September night in 1965, following Delaware's most haunting disappearance, and watching how justice buried for more than 30 years finally found its way back into the light. Evening in Milford, Delaware was still as the surface of the Mispillion River, lit only by the weak yellow glow of street lamps spilling over narrow sidewalks and rows of weathered wooden houses pressed close together. The summer air hung heavy with a thin layer of humidity that clung to porches and fluttered the curtains whenever the breeze came off the river. In a small house at the end of one quiet street, 8-year-old Mary Ellen Weaver, tiny, with pale blonde hair, was seen for the last time in her bedroom. The room looked exactly as always: a little bed by the window, a dim nightlight, toys neatly lined up on a wooden shelf, and the children's book she always read before falling asleep. Her mother stood in the doorway, watched the girl slip under the covers, eyes already drowsing, then gently pulled the door almost shut, leaving behind a peaceful darkness that gave no hint of anything wrong. The night passed quietly, the way dozens of other nights had in Milford. No cars speeding past, no hurried footsteps on the cobblestone streets, just humidity and the smell of nightgrass blending into the slow rhythm of small-town life. Then morning came. Early sunlight filtered through the curtains, making the dust on the floor more visible. Mary's mother stepped out of the kitchen, ready to wake her daughter the way she did every morning, but when she pushed open the bedroom door she froze. The little bed was empty, the blanket pulled to one side. The window stood wide open, the curtain blown inward and twisted, as if someone had just passed through. The room was unnaturally still. No sound of a child, no sign Mary had gotten up and wandered somewhere in the house. She called her daughter's name softly at first, then louder and louder, the sound echoing through the house with no answer. Every room she checked tightened her chest a little more. The living room empty, the kitchen silent, the backyard showing no trace of Mary. A sudden chill ran down her spine, completely at odds with the humid Delaware morning. The back door was still locked, everything in the house untouched, nothing to suggest the girl had left on her own. Silence wrapped around the little house like thick fog, squeezing every breath. Mary's mother fought the panic rising inside her, but her trembling hands betrayed everything. She scanned the room one more time, desperate for any overlooked sign, but everything was exactly the same, except Mary was gone. She couldn't wait another second. She hurried to the telephone in the living room. Her hands shook violently as she lifted the receiver, breathing fast, voice catching just before she dialed the numbers to tell police that her daughter was missing. The moment the missing child call came in from the little house at the end of the street, the Milford duty officer shot up from his chair, one hand clamping the headset to his ear, the other scribbling down details from a mother whose voice kept breaking. He forced himself to stay calm to keep her calm, but the words appearing on the pad in front of him were enough to tell him how bad this was. 8-year-old girl gone from her bedroom overnight, window wide open, no sign inside the house that she left on her own. After double-checking name, address and time of discovery, he set the pen down for half a second, as if to make sure he hadn't misheard, then grabbed the radio and sent an urgent call to the nearest patrol unit. The first patrol car arrived within minutes. The officers stepped inside and immediately felt the chaos and fear filling the rooms. The mother stood by the table, hands shaking too hard to hold the glass of water in front of her. They didn't pepper her with questions, they simply asked her to show them Mary's bedroom, where it all began. The wooden door was eased open, revealing the small room with its empty bed, the curtain still swaying, and an emptiness that took your breath away. The officers noted only what was obvious to the eye: blanket pulled aside, window open, no evidence Mary left the house herself. Not wanting the mother to repeat everything she'd already told the dispatcher, one officer took her to the living room to go over the essentials again. What time Mary usually went to bed, anything unusual the night before, who had come in or out of the house, which areas she had already checked before calling police. Every answer was quickly written down and radioed back to Milford's coordination center to activate the missing child protocol. Within minutes, more patrol cars appeared around the house. One team was assigned to canvass the immediate neighborhood, walking block by block calling Mary's name, hoping she was hiding somewhere out of fear or had wandered off to play. Another group followed the narrow alleys behind the houses, where old wooden fences separated tiny backyards. Officers paused to ask anyone stepping outside or sweeping their porch whether they had heard noises or seen anything unusual overnight. The coordination center immediately sent out an internal alert, pulling in more units from the Mississippian River area and the roads leading to open land. Milford was small, which cut both ways, easy to set up roadblocks, easy for a predator to use the quiet back road. Using a paper map spread across a patrol car hood, the captain divided the search into zones: east to the riverbank, north to a few abandoned houses, west to the low reed beds and trails leading out of town. To bring in more manpower, police used loudspeakers to ask residents to help. In almost no time, neighbors, local teens, and even early commuters stopped, asked what was happening and volunteered. They grabbed flashlights, light jackets, and fanned out with the officers, checking every bush and dark pathway. During all of this, no one was thinking about evidence or theories. Every ounce of energy went into finding Mary as fast as possible. Though teams went in different directions, they stayed in constant radio contact, reporting anything that looked off: small footprints in soft dirt, unexplained noises, patches of trampled grass. Every time the radio crackled, hearts stopped, hoping for good news, but most reports were just fragments. Inside the house, Mary's mother sat motionless at the table, eyes fixed on the front door as if her little girl might come running back any second. Outside, her name kept echoing through the misty Milford morning, carried on an air thick with tension and frantic searching. A race against time had begun, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath, praying it wasn't already too late. The calls of Mary's name kept ringing out through the thin morning mist on Milford's outskirts, as search teams spread out along the pre-drawn grid. When one group moved deeper into the reed beds near Mississippian Marsh, where the grass grew waist-high and the soft ground held clear footprints, the sudden quiet made everyone slow down. No distant traffic, no voices from other teams, just the soft splash of water when the wind moved across the marsh. That stillness felt like a warning, forcing them to scan every patch of ground more carefully. One of the volunteer searchers at the front of the line spotted it first: a section of grass pressed flat and still damp, as if something heavy had recently fallen on it. He raised a hand to stop the group, The others closed in behind him, keeping silent to listen. As they moved closer, a small shape appeared among the reeds, lying motionless in a position that made everyone's heart drop. An officer knelt, checked for breath, and when he felt the faintest rise and fall of her chest, he managed only a rough whisper, "She's alive." No one wasted a second. One officer radioed the command center, voice tight but clear. Two others quickly cleared reeds around her to open a path, making sure they could get Mary out without causing more harm. Even so, they were careful not to step anywhere unnecessary. Everyone understood that where she was found could become the key to the whole case, even if no official order had come yet. While giving Mary first aid, the team noted her exact position, a shallow dip among the reeds, not far from the trail that led into the marsh and close to the softer ground near the water's edge. That location suggested a possible route. The perpetrator could have followed the trail from the residential area, then cut across the open ground to this spot. It lined up with what earlier teams had seen, lines of flattened grass running straight from the neighborhood deep into the marsh. Another officer quickly marked the perimeter with temporary caution tape, expanding it in a wide half-moon so no civilians would accidentally walk through. They didn't collect evidence or analyze anything yet. That would be for the investigative team, but they jotted down environmental details: soil moisture, reed density, distance to the water and nearest trail, giving them a rough initial picture of the site. While one group stayed to protect the secondary scene, the others carefully lifted Mary out of the reeds. They gently placed her on a makeshift stretcher, avoiding any pressure on her neck or torso. She was still very weak, eyes closed, but the faint movement in her chest and shallow breathing meant time was still on their side, if they could get her to the hospital fast enough. As they carried her out, officers walked on both sides to make sure no one strayed into the marked area. When the patrol car sped away with lights flashing toward Milford Memorial Hospital, the people left behind watched it go. Fully aware of what had just happened, they had found Mary alive, but the truth behind it was still far from clear. The search captain took a minute to mark the exact coordinates on his paper map, added detailed notes on how to reach the spot, then reported everything to command so the investigative team could take over. As the teams dispersed to keep checking nearby areas, the patch of reeds where Mary had lain remained untouched, alone in a morning still misty with the soft sound of water lapping at the marsh. It was the case's first major secondary crime scene, a place that held more questions than answers. No one yet knew what it was saying, but everyone understood one obvious truth. A normal night of a child going missing could not end like this without someone else's hand involved. And that truth, still hazy, became the driving force pushing authorities into what would be anything but a simple investigation. The patrol car sped away from the reed marsh, racing toward Milford Memorial Hospital, while the remaining officers secured the area where Mary had been found, leaving behind a silent stretch of land where the morning wind still swept through the clumps of reed. The journey to get Mary to the hospital was tense and hushed, and when the car screeched to a stop outside the emergency room entrance, the medical team immediately took over the frail little girl, who was weak but still clinging to a faint breath. The emergency room doors swung shut, separating Mary from all the noise outside, allowing the doctors to focus on the daunting task of stabilizing the fragile life of a child who had just endured a night of horror in the swamp. The harsh white lights illuminated Mary's pallid skin, making her injuries stand out more starkly than ever. Across her throat ran a long slash from one side to the other, deep and angled in a dangerous slant. The doctors quickly assessed the extent of the damage, careful not to apply any additional pressure to the torn tissue. No major arteries had been severed, but the soft tissue and vocal cords had suffered severe trauma. The drag marks on Mary's arms and legs were documented as evidence that she had been pulled across the rough surface of the reed area, resulting in widespread bruising and multiple serious abrasions. Inside the treatment room, the soft clink of medical instruments mingled with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The doctors exchanged brief but urgent words, each performing their role with maximum speed and focus. Mary's airway was the top priority, and once it was secured, they placed temporary sutures on the neck wound to stop the bleeding and reduce the risk of infection. Initial signs showed that Mary was conscious but exhausted. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, and her chest rose and fell delicately, as if even breathing seemed to cause pain at the gash in her throat. The sound of footsteps echoed softly outside the door, signaling that police were waiting for an update. The lead doctor stepped out of the ER, his face professionally calm but his eyes unable to hide the gravity of the situation. He informed them that Mary could not speak at this stage, not due to panic or stress, but because her vocal cords and throat tissue were too severely damaged. Any attempt to produce sound would tear the wound further, making verbal communication impossible. That news silenced the nearby officers for a moment. They understood the victim was the only person who could tell them what happened, and losing her ability to speak made gathering information exponentially harder. The silence didn't last long. Duty wouldn't allow it. A rapid discussion began between the investigation team and the medical staff, each side staying within their scope, but fully aware they were standing together on the thin line between the girl's survival and the urgent need for clues from her. Medical staff recommended limiting contact and keeping the environment as quiet as possible so Mary could recover. Her throat injury was so severe that even slight stress could reopen the wound. Police respected the advice while requesting a special protocol that would still allow them to obtain information within safe medical boundaries. The agreed-upon method: Mary would be given paper and pencil to write down anything she remembered. No rushed questions, no pressure, just letting her write at her own pace. A private room was prepared for Mary, isolated from the noise of the The lighting was dimmed to a gentle level, enough for staff to monitor her, but not enough to cause headaches or added stress to a child who had just suffered massive trauma. On the small table beside the bed, the doctor placed a stack of blank paper and a carefully sharpened pencil. A quiet signal that whenever Mary was ready, she could begin telling her story in her own time. Out in the hallway, the Milford police began adjusting their strategy. They noted the medical conclusions: severe injuries, signs of being dragged, unable to speak, loss of verbal communication for an undetermined period. The case was now more clearly classified internally: kidnapping, violent assault, and attempted murder. Each element was carefully documented, not yet in a forensic sense, as that stage had not arrived, but according to the duties of the initial phase, confirming the nature of the crime to prepare for the next steps in the investigation. While Mary lay silently in the white room, accompanied only by the steady beep of the monitor, no one on the medical or police team knew how much detail she would be able to recall. Yet everyone shared the same thought. The account, written in a child's shaky handwriting, would become the centerpiece of the entire investigation ahead. Soft yellow light fell across the little girl's exhausted face, and though she still lay motionless, her breathing had become more even. The stack of blank paper and pencil beside the bed were no longer mere decoration in a children's ward. They had become the only means for Mary to recount what she had endured. Under the doctor's supervision, an officer gently placed the first sheet on the small table and stepped back so Mary would not feel pressure. Her first attempt was slow. Her small hand trembled as she tried to lift the pencil, but the very first marks on the paper marked the beginning of information that could determine the entire direction of the case. The opening lines were simple but clear. Picked up out of bed. The handwriting was childish, a little scribbly and labored, but the information was unmistakable. The next sheet added another detail: hand over mouth. Mary included a few quick sketches beside the words, trying to convey how tightly she had been gagged so no sound could escape. The officers did not interrupt. They simply stepped forward to collect each finished page. Another officer silently copied the contents onto a temporary board so no piece would be lost. On the third note, Mary wrote, "Put in car," then below it, "sat on lap." That detail drew particular attention from the officers, as it could help them visualize how the perpetrator drove, while keeping hold of the victim. Mary continued adding descriptions: steering wheel in front, soft seats, a very strong She wrote slowly, each letter seeming to cost her strength, yet her persistence kept the room completely silent. Then the information grew sharper. Starting with the fourth sheet, Mary tried to describe the man who took her from the house. She wrote, "Hoarse voice." Then beneath it, "Smells like cigarettes." Another page, "Smells like beer," and the next, "Talked a lot." Each seemingly simple descriptor was actually highly distinctive, because not many people in the Milford area at that time were heavy smokers and beer drinkers on the same night, especially while driving. The next sheet made every officer in the room freeze. Mary wrote a single word, no question mark, no further explanation, just that one word. But for an 8-year-old child who had just been through overwhelming trauma, remembering the name of the man who took her was not something to be taken lightly. The officers exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone understood this could be the most crucial piece of the entire story Mary was struggling to write. Each completed sheet was neatly stacked on the side table, and one officer organized them into 4 main categories. The first group concerned the person: hoarse voice, cigarette smell, beer smell, talkative, name Len. The second group concerned the vehicle: gray car, bench seat, smell inside the car. The third group was actions: carried from bed, mouth covered, placed in car, forced to sit on lap. The final group was rote: the direction Mary tried to recall through images passing the window: shadowy trees, bumpy road, dim yellow light. These categories were created to give the investigation team a more systematic view, and prevent emotion from clouding judgment. Mary's notes, though coming from a child, displayed a surprising level of specificity and consistency. Every detail could serve as a marker to follow, from the perpetrator's habits and the vehicle he used to the path taken from the residential area to the swamp. In the hospital room, Mary kept writing until her hand grew too weak and the pencil slipped from her small finger. The police asked for nothing more and posed no new questions. They simply gathered the final pages and promised to return when she had the strength to continue. Before leaving, they paused for a moment, looking at the little girl resting in the soft yellow light, knowing she had already done everything she possibly could to help them, even though her voice had been taken away. Out in the hallway, the officers spread Mary's notes across a large table, marking each detail with pencil, examining connections between them, and what they had already observed at the scene. The thread of information was becoming clearer, and although many questions remained, they now held the first clues provided directly by the victim herself, an invaluable source in a case that had seemed swallowed by darkness. As soon as Mary's initial notes were categorized, a team of investigators was dispatched back to the Reed Marsh, where the girl had been found. The location map and brief description left by the search team gave them a clearer picture, but they needed to examine the scene themselves in a systematic way to ensure nothing that could become a lead was overlooked. The sun had not yet fully risen, mist still clung to the reeds, and the footprints of the earlier search party formed clear paths leading to the depression where Mary had lain. Upon entering the cordoned area, the investigators moved carefully to avoid disturbing any untouched ground. No one spoke loudly. Each person maintained enough distance to observe while preventing new tracks. They followed the trail of flattened grass, noting the likely direction the perpetrator had taken before abandoning Mary. The first thing that stood out deeper in the reeds was a beer can lying on its side in the soft earth, the metal dulled but still clearly showing a brand common in the area at that time. An investigator gently lifted the can with a cloth, placed it in a temporary evidence bag, and noted the exact discovery location. Not far away, a half-crushed cigarette butt was wedged between 2 clumps of reed. The faint smell of tobacco still lingered in the damp air, drawing extra attention, especially since Mary had specifically noted the perpetrator smelled of cigarettes. An officer used tweezers to collect the butt, sealed it in a separate envelope, and labeled it for later reference. The surrounding ground was photographed from multiple angles to preserve the original context. Another team member scanned the edge of the marsh, where the ground was softer and revealed fairly clear tire impression. Although they could not immediately identify the vehicle type or model, they knew every trace had to be fully documented. They measured the track width, recorded the direction the tires had entered, then photographed each section before sketching an overall diagram. The lines showed the path the vehicle took into the area, and its relative position to where Mary was found, providing a basis for later route analysis. Meanwhile, one investigator crouched close to the ground where small dark fibers were tangled in the wet grass. They were slightly curly as if pulled from a car floor mat. He carefully collected each fiber with tweezers, keeping them separate to avoid cross-contamination. Though advanced analysis was not yet possible, these fibers were considered important, especially since Mary had clearly described sitting on the perpetrator's lap and feeling the car's interior. Once the main items were secured, the team took wide-angle photographs covering the depression, the path into the marsh, old footprints, and areas where reeds were unusually bent. The officer in charge of mapping the scene carefully marked every evidence location on the diagram, confirming distances between points and using natural landmarks such as small trees, mounds, or the nearby water's edge. This step was critical for later reconstructing the sequence of events as accurately as possible with the tools available at the time. When all documentation was complete, the team leader paused to survey the entire area once, from the trail leading in, the deep tire tracks, to the spot where Mary lay. Everything suggested a hurried but deliberate act. The perpetrator had not lingered. Every trace pointed to a quick, forceful and cold-blooded action. Yet that very haste had left behind small pieces of the story, enough to hope that piecing them together would open new investigative paths. Before leaving the scene, the team double-checked every sample, ensuring all items were properly sealed and numbered according to regulation. They did not perform on-site forensic analysis or make technical guesses, as modern techniques did not yet exist. Their only task was to collect, describe, document thoroughly, and transport everything back to the station for careful storage to support the next phases of the investigation. When everything was finished, they left the reed marsh behind, leaving a silent scene where only the wind rustled through reeds taller than a man. But now, instead of a place shrouded in mystery, the area had become a source of the first tangible clues, small but valuable fragments gathered with the investigation team's meticulous care, so that one day they might all connect to reveal the truth. The physical evidence collected from the reed area was brought back to the station while the investigation team continued analyzing Mary's notes to piece together the chain of events that had taken the little girl from her bedroom to the remote marsh. The sheets of paper with her trembling handwriting were spread across the table, placed next to a map of the town of Milford and the crime scene notes. By combining these sources, they began reconstructing the route the perpetrator most likely took on the night Mary disappeared. The starting point was always Mary's house, located in a quiet residential neighborhood connected to several small alleys leading to the main road. Mary's bedroom window faced the backyard, where a dirt path ran along an old wooden fence, normally used only by residents to reach the grass or take out trash. This led the team to focus on the theory that the perpetrator approached from the rear of the house rather than the front door, minimizing the chance of being spotted by neighbors. From that narrow path, the perpetrator could follow a strip of land, staying away from streetlights, and reach the main road without making significant noise. From that point, the map revealed two possible routes to the Mispillion Marsh Reed. One ran along a gravel road regularly used by trucks during the day. The other was narrower and quieter, just a dirt trail that hugged the edge of a sparse woods before opening into the marsh. The officers marked the second route as the more probable. Little traffic, lower risk of detection, especially at night. Up to this point, the team used the details Mary described to estimate timing and speed of travel. She wrote about yellow lights passing across the window and the feeling of the vehicle traveling over rough road surface. Those details matched the sparse streetlights in Milford and the unpaved roads leading to the marsh. On the map, the lighted sections were far apart, and when a vehicle passed, the pale yellow glow would shine directly through the window exactly as Mary remembered. To strengthen the hypothesis, police re-interviewed several residents living near the road, people who might have heard or seen unusual movement the night Mary vanished. Most said they went to bed dirty, but a few recalled noteworthy details. A man whose house was close to the trail reported hearing a vehicle engine running slowly, as if trying to stay quiet at a time when cars rarely passed. An elderly woman on the opposite corner remembered a flash of light through her curtains, different from the headlights of neighbors who regularly came home late. The accounts were fragmented but consistent with the assumption that the perpetrator entered the marsh via this little-used road. Once the route was reconstructed, the team shifted to building a suspect list based on Mary's description. A man with a raspy voice, smelling of cigarettes and beer, talkative, and possibly named Len. Combined with the detail of a gray car with a bench seat common in the 1950s, early 1960s, they began checking vehicle registration records in Milford and surrounding areas. Popular gray sedans with bench seats from that era included late 1950s Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth models. It was impossible to pinpoint the exact make from a child's description, but the bench seat, dark interior and slight vibration when driving on dirt roads considerably narrowed the field. Officers contacted the local motor vehicle office for a list of owners of similar vehicles, then filtered by geographic areas close enough for the perpetrator to reach Mary's house quickly. When the vehicle owner list arrived at the station, the team began matching each name against the traits Mary recorded. Anyone with a habit of evening drinking, a history of disorderly conduct, or noted as a heavy smoker was flagged for further checking. In addition, anyone whose name began with L received closer scrutiny, although police could not yet be certain whether Len was a real name or a nickname. The initial suspect list was not overly long, but it provided a clearer direction, far clearer than the blind early hour. In the small briefing room at the station, the officers stared at that list with a feeling that was both heavy and faintly hopeful. Mary's smudged notes, the tire tracks in the damp soil, and the route into the reeds, everything was starting to connect into the first outlines of the case picture. Although they had no conclusive evidence yet, the team knew they had taken one critical step forward, identifying the perpetrator's likely path of travel, and building a suspect list based on the only description that came directly from the victim. From those fragile clues, they prepared to move into the next phase, a phase that would demand persistence and patience, because the road to the truth remained very long and full of challenges ahead. The initial suspect list, compiled from the description and matching vehicle type, was only the beginning. To narrow it further, the investigation team decided to enlist the help of a specialist police sketch artist. Mary's notes, especially the descriptions of voice, cigarette smell, drinking and smoking habits, and the facial features she glimpsed, became the primary material for creating the composite. Even though Mary could not yet speak, every mark she had made earlier contained a piece of memory clear enough for the artist to visualize the man who appeared in her bedroom. In the hospital room, under a doctor's supervision, the artist approached Mary gently, making sure not to pressure or upset her. He presented simple suggested sketches of face shapes, hairstyles, noses and mouths, then patiently waited while Mary nodded or shook her head slightly to select the closest match to what she remembered. Mary used a pencil to mark mouths that drooped slightly on one side, deep-set and somewhat tired eyes, very short hair, and one distinctive feature she confirmed with a small circle, a faint scar beside the mouth. Gradually, from those individual traits, the artist produced a complete composite, a middle-aged man with a rough face, hard-to-read expression, deep eyes bearing clear signs of years of heavy smoking. That face emerged under the yellow light like a shadowy figure lurking in nighttime Milford, both familiar and strange, yet difficult to place specifically, the kind of face small-town residents might notice at a bar, gas station or dock, but not remember exactly. Once the sketch was finished, the team rushed it back to the station and began the task of comparing it to local resident files. They arranged thick paper folders containing vehicle registrations, local tax records, lists of residents working at nearby factories, and scattered notes about individuals previously cautioned or cited for disturbance. The sketch was placed in the center of the table so everyone flipping through files could clearly see the features to match: the scar beside the mouth, long face, deep eyes, and age roughly in the 30s or 40s. Anyone whose appearance was close was moved to a secondary list for later follow-up, while obvious mismatches were set aside. Several names appeared repeatedly in disturbance logs: bar fights, public intoxication, loud noise late at night, and received thorough review. However, most of those individuals had solid alibis or looks that did not match Mary's sketch at all. While cross-referencing files, the team also questioned local residents, taking the sketch door to door in key areas. Everyone who looked at the drawing squinted and tried to remember whether they had seen that man. A few said the face resembled someone who lived near the docks the previous year, but they weren't sure. Others thought they had seen a similar figure at the gas station, but when pressed for details they couldn't recall more. These vague leads did not move the investigation forward, because Milford was a small town and faces like that blended in among local laborers, hard to distinguish, hard to identify. The team also reviewed records of individuals with minor prior offenses. Although no one had a history of serious violence, the list was still examined carefully. Anyone known for heavy drinking and smoking, cited for driving while impaired, or noted for erratic behavior was marked for field checking. Yet when those on the secondary list were brought in for verification and direct comparison to the sketch, nearly all were ruled out or had alibis for the time of Mary's abduction. The difficulty became even clearer when the team realized that Mary's description, however hard she tried, was limited by a child's viewpoint. She had only glimpsed the perpetrator's face in the dim glow of a nightlight, while in a state of terror. That made even the sharpest details like the depth of the scar or exact nose shape hard to pin down. The composite was therefore reasonably accurate, but not sharp enough to differentiate between two similar-looking men in a small community. After many days of comparing, interviewing and screening, the suspect list had barely shrunk. Those whose appearance came close all had clear reasons for exclusion, while others failed to match any of Mary's described traits. The sketch, though useful, was not enough to produce a breakthrough. When the large suspect board was finally taken down, the captain looked at the composite one last time and set it aside. The investigation was visibly stalling, like the reed-covered path into the marsh, long, hazy, and impossible to see what lay at the end. But if there was one thing they were all certain of, it was this: that sketch would not be forgotten. Other clues might yet surface to make it matter again in the future. Efforts to match the composite sketch against Milford resident files ended in quiet disappointment, and the investigation room gradually sank into a feeling of deadlock. Although the team had obtained precious notes from Mary, reconstructed a plausible perpetrator route, collected evidence from the reeds, and produced a portrait of a man with a distinctive scar, everything remained disconnected pieces. The investigators stared at the large wallboard covered with diagrams, crime scene photos, and notes, but no segment connected firmly enough to identify the perpetrator. The era's context only pushed the case further toward a dead end. Late 1960s forensic technology was still developing slowly, relying mainly on visual observation and manual comparison. Evidence collected from the scene, though carefully preserved, could not be deeply analyzed by any modern technique, simply because those tools did not yet exist. No DNA testing, no advanced fiber comparison, no automated databases. Tire tracks could only be measured for width and tread pattern, not traced to a specific manufacturer year. Carpet fibers were simply noted, with no polymer analysis or precise color matching. Both the beer can and cigarette butts only proved someone had smoked and drunk in the area, hardly unusual in Milford. Meanwhile, fingerprint databases were still in their infancy. Delaware's fingerprint records were stored on paper with no automated matching system. Comparison could only be done by eye, one record at a time, and the volume far exceeded the capacity of a small town's limited force. No complete fingerprints were recovered from the scene, and the disturbed soil was insufficient to yield clear footprint. Police understood that if the perpetrator left no standout personal trace, they had no way to find him with such limited means. On the witness side, statements from Milford residents were not strong enough to push the investigation further. Most people were sound asleep when Mary was taken. Those who heard a slow-moving vehicle or saw a flash of light could not recall a face or license plate. Some witnesses weren't even certain whether the sound or light they remembered was from that exact night or another, because Milford was so quiet and minor nighttime events usually went unnoticed. In a small routine-driven community, any late-night movement could easily be confused across different days. The composite also failed to shorten the suspect list. Mary's limited viewpoint made the perpetrator's facial features only approximate. Men with similar appearances, especially working-class men who smoked and drank heavily, were too numerous. Whenever the team reached a name that seemed promising, they encountered verified alibis or witnesses proving non-involvement. Each name crossed off meant another investigative path closed. The entire team had to face the reality that their efforts had reached their absolute limits. They had gathered plenty of scattered data, but no piece was strong enough to connect and point to a specific suspect. On the desks, Mary's notes, however valuable, still could not tell the full story. She had only glimpsed the perpetrator's face, and in the darkness of that terrifying night her memories were scrambled by extreme fear. What she managed to recall was extraordinary, but not enough to identify one man among hundreds of anonymous locals. The Mary Ellen Weaver case gradually entered a state of suspension, not forgotten, but no longer advancing. Investigators revisited the files several times, trying to find hidden links in the smallest details, but after many months the investigation remained at the starting point. As years passed, a thick layer of dust settled on the folders in the iron cabinet, testament to both time and the powerlessness of a force constrained by limited technology. Finally, in a quiet internal meeting with few words spoken, the captain announced the necessary but heavy decision. The case would be moved to storage and classified as a cold case. All collected evidence was carefully sealed, renumbered, and transferred to the department's long-term storage. The composite sketch was kept with the main file in case new witnesses or a future reinvestigation emerged. Every note Mary wrote with her trembling hand that day was placed in clear plastic sleeves, a reminder that the victim was still alive and one day the truth might be found in those very lines. The investigation room gradually emptied as documents were put away, leaving only the whiteboard that just weeks earlier had been covered with theories. The case was not erased. It was simply sleeping, waiting for another chance, another era when technology would be strong enough to break the silence the perpetrator had created that year. But at that moment in late 1960s Milford, all the police could do was accept they had no further leads to follow. The Mary Ellen Weaver case file sat in storage for years, buried among hundreds of others that the Delaware State Police investigation team still hoped would one day find answers. The 1980s brought significant changes to law enforcement. Many states began partially digitizing records, building semi-automated fingerprint matching systems, and improving evidence storage capabilities. It was these changes that led to some old cases being pulled for review, and Mary's file quickly made the priority list because of the case's severity and the fact that the victim was still alive. When the file was pulled from storage, the sealed evidence bags from the late 1960s were also brought out for re-examination. The bags containing the beer can, cigarette butts, and pieces of car carpet were still intact, the seals undamaged, proving the evidence had been properly preserved. This gave a faint glimmer of hope that any remaining fingerprints on the can or cigarette butts might now be usable in the new era. Forensic technicians began re-scanning every item using methods far more advanced than the crude tools available 2 decades earlier. That hope, however, quickly hit a wall. Any fingerprints that might have been on the beer can had faded over time, and the cigarette butts had been damp for too long in the reeds that year, causing the natural skin oils to disappear completely. The technicians tried every available technique from traditional fingerprint powder to methods designed to raise faint latents, but nothing produced a clear enough pattern to enter into the system. Still, they documented everything and uploaded whatever fragments remained into Delaware's new semi-automated database, a primitive limited system that mainly contained recent arrests. When the results came back, the screen simply read no match. None of the fingerprints in the system corresponded to the faint prints on Mary's evidence. That meant the perpetrator either had no prior record or had moved out of state, so his prints never made it into Delaware's system. Though disappointing, the result was within the team's expectations. Milford was a small town, and the odds were high that the offender was someone with little or no recorded history in the state system. Undeterred, the reinvestigation team decided to broaden their approach by recanvassing the 1965 list of Milford area residents. Younger officers were assigned to re-interview anyone still living near Mary's house who might have seen something they once dismissed as unimportant. But 20 years is a long time. Many people had moved away, some had died, and most memories had faded. The accounts that were already vague in 1965 were now even harder to pin down. The few residents who had lived in Milford since the 1960s tried to recall the night Mary disappeared. They mentioned car lights passing by, a quiet engine sound, or a fleeting uneasy feeling. Details that were already in the original file. But when pressed for specifics, almost everyone admitted they no longer remembered clearly. Everything blurred together with dozens, hundreds of other quiet nights in a small town. No one could tell whether they were truly remembering that night, or mixing old memories with what they had later read in the papers or heard repeated about the case. The team also tried contacting the original persons of interest. Some were now elderly, some had moved to other states, and the rest had even stronger alibis than before thanks to updated archived records. This sweep produced no new leads. Instead, it only confirmed that the original suspect list, though carefully compiled, had never contained a single individual strong enough to charge. In the reinvestigation team's office, the Milford map stayed pinned in the same spot, alongside crime scene photos that had yellowed with age. Yet the connecting lines between pieces of information remained the same as before, fragmented and lacking cohesion. There was no DNA to compare, no surveillance footage, no street cameras, and no meaningful advances in reasoning the case. All they had were sketches, an 8-year-old girl's notes, and a few pieces of evidence that could not be deeply analyzed. At the end of the reinvestigation, the team had to conclude, no significant progress. Even with more technology than in the 1960s, the available tools were still insufficient to overcome this case's limitation. Mary Ellen Weaver's file was returned to storage, this time with an additional note, re-examined in 1980, no progress. Once again, the case sank into silence, waiting for another moment, a moment when technology would far surpass anything anyone in Milford could have imagined. The early 1980s reinvestigation efforts ended without any meaningful progress, and Mary Ellen Weaver's case file slipped back into silence in storage. However, as the 1990s arrived, Criminal investigation in the United States underwent a revolutionary change. DNA profiling began being applied to serious cases. Federal forensic labs rolled out RFLP technology, one of the first DNA analysis methods capable of individually identifying people from biological samples. Delaware, though not a leader among states, quickly gained access and started applying these new tools to long-dormant cases. Thanks to the creation of the Cold Case Unit, a new division formed to review stalled investigations, Mary's file was pulled from storage yet again. The unit's investigators examined every piece of sealed evidence from the old paper and wax seals were still intact, and preservation had been good enough that some biological samples, despite being over 2 decades old, still showed traces usable under the new technology. In particular, the blood-stained and fluid-stained fabric pieces found on Mary's clothing at the scene became the focus of attention. Each evidence bag was opened in a controlled environment to prevent cross-contamination. Forensic specialists carefully scraped the tiniest samples from the old stains, placed them in glass tubes, and prepared them for RFLP analysis. The method was time-consuming and required larger samples than later technologies, but it was the first tool powerful enough to distinguish DNA between unrelated individuals. For a case almost 30 years old like Mary's, this was an unprecedented opportunity. In the lab, the forensic specialist explained the general process to the Cold Case Unit investigators. DNA is extracted from the biological sample, cut with enzymes, then separated into characteristic bands via electrophoresis. Those bands could later be compared against DNA from any future suspect or against the early FBI database. CADIS in its infancy, which at the time held only a limited number of profiles from participating pilot states, but it was a giant leap forward for investigation. Weeks later, the first results emerged from the lab. The specialist confirmed that usable DNA had indeed been recovered from Mary's evidence. No one had dared hope for this, given that the samples had been exposed to damp conditions in the reeds before collection, and then stored for 3 decades. Yet somehow a portion of the genetic structure had survived well enough to produce a complete DNA profile. The Cold Case Unit immediately entered the profile into the state's newly created electronic file and submitted the unknown perpetrator's DNA to the FBI for inclusion in CADIS. Even though the system was tiny and far less populated than today, adding the offender's DNA opened the door to a future match, whether months or decades away. While awaiting federal results, the team re-examined the entire old file to see if any original suspect had later been arrested or documented by authorities. If one of them had been picked up for anything from a minor offense to a serious crime, the odds were higher that their DNA had been collected. Every name was checked again, every person cross-referenced with the new data, but nothing showed a hit. In Milford, many of the older investigators who had worked the original 1965 case were now retired, but when they heard the case had been reopened, they expressed cautious hope. Everyone understood that DNA technology could do things unimaginable at the time of the crime. A tiny blood stain, a faint fluid mark, or a single remaining skin cell, things they could only note on paper back then, now had the potential to become the key to exposing the perpetrator. Once again, the Mary Ellen Weaver case came back to life, not through new suspects or surprise statements, but through the power of science. And although no one knew when a result would appear, everyone recognized that the era had changed. The thick fog that had shrouded the case for nearly 30 years finally had a chance to be peeled away, layer by layer, thanks to the newly decoded DNA bands. The usable DNA recovered from the 1965 evidence energized the Cold Case Unit, and among the newer investigators assigned to the unit, Detective Raymond Holt stood out for his patience and habit of digging into the smallest detail. The moment Mary Ellen Weaver's file landed on his desk, Holt began reorganizing every document chronologically and by type. Mary's notes, 1960s Milford maps, the Marsh crime scene location, the suspect composite, the original suspect list, and the list of residents near Mary's house. Holt spent many afternoons in the dusty records room, yellow light falling on stacks of faded paper. On his desk he placed the note where Mary had written Len in clear but childlike handwriting. Next to it was the composite sketch of a man with deep-set eyes, a rough face and a small scar at the corner of his mouth, a detail Holt considered more important than any other clue. He also spread out the old Milford map, marking the reconstructed route from Mary's house to Mispillion Marsh, the places with streetlights, the dark turns and the low traffic areas. Each pencil line formed connecting circles as if he were examining a timeline web stretching from. Holt paid special attention to the three elements Mary had described: a man who smoked heavily and smelled of beer, a gray car with bench seats, a common 1950s sedan style, a name that sounded like He reviewed the old suspect list, flipping every page and comparing every name previously marked in red or green ink. Men whose names started with L, or who lived near the route shown on the map, were highlighted in pencil, but no one on the original list had a strong enough combination of characteristics, missing the distinctive scar, lacking the matching vehicle, or having an ironclad alibi. Holt widened the scope. He pulled police records from the years after 1965, the period when the perpetrator might have changed behavior, moved, or committed other crimes. While combing through those files, one name suddenly appeared in a 1974 assault report: Leonard Hale. The man had been arrested for attacking a woman under strikingly similar circumstances, threatening with a knife, attacking at night, reeking of beer and heavy cigarette smoke. Holt immediately put a red mark next to Hale's name. The coincidences multiplied the deeper Holt dug deeper. In the 1974 report, a witness described Hale as having a small scar near his left mouth corner, an extremely rare detail in other files, and an exact match to the 1965 composite Mary had confirmed. The report also stated Hale drove an old gray sedan from the late. Holt felt a chill down his spine. This was the first time in decades of investigation that an overlooked name matched so many characteristics. Holt reopened Mary's notes and read every line the little girl had written: smoke, beer smell, bench seat, gray car, and the word Len. Shaky but determined handwriting. Everything aligned astonishingly with the information about Leonard Hale. Holt was almost certain Mary could not have invented such specific details. He cross-checked the Milford map for Hale's 1960s address, and discovered Hale had lived only a few blocks from Mary's house, close enough to know the area well, yet far enough not to be considered a close neighbor. When Holt plotted the route from Hale's old address to the trail leading to the marsh, the overlap was disturbing. It perfectly matched what Mary had described seeing from inside the car that night. Not stopping there, Holt formally requested archived court and administrative records to verify Hale's residences in the early. The recovered documents showed Hale had worked at an auto repair shop on the outskirts of Milford, regularly got off work late, and had a history of drinking at a bar near the industrial area, a location only minutes from the likely escape route. The overlap of workplace, vehicle, daily habits, and identifying features made Holt realize he might finally be looking at a real suspect, one the case had missed from the beginning. Everything still needed DNA confirmation, but every lead, every note, and every scattered piece of information collected over 3 decades was now converging on a single point: Leonard Hale. Holt closed the thick file and looked again at the old composite sketch. The face drawn in 1965 suddenly seemed sharper under the office light. He knew the critical moment had arrived. One more step, and if the DNA matched, this 30-year-old case would finally have the answer the entire town of Milford had waited for far too long. The information Holt uncovered about Leonard Hale pointed to a clear suspect, but he knew that in the end, every theory had to come down to one thing: the DNA from the 1965 evidence. Only a match could deliver the breakthrough this case had waited nearly 3 decades for. With careful urgency, Holt submitted a formal request to the state forensic lab to compare the DNA recovered from Mary Ellen Weaver's clothing with the DNA profile stored from Leonard Hale's. The lab accepted the request and fast-tracked it because it involved the violent crime against a child. The 1974 sample came from a similarly brutal assault, and what had caught Holt's attention was that Hale had left a small amount of his own blood on the victim's shirt, a wound that created a DNA profile preserved in the FBI's pilot database. That made a direct comparison possible. For days, the lab used the RFLP method to separate the DNA structure from the 1965 evidence, producing a distinctive banding pattern, then ran it side by side with Hale's. Under the lab's lights, the DNA bands appeared as white bars against dark gel. Technicians placed the 2 gel images next to each other, examining every marker position on the genetic map, a process that demanded time and absolute precision. One quiet afternoon, while Holt was reviewing Hale's 1960s residency records, the desk phone rang. It was the lead forensic examiner, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. Every marker matched perfectly. All comparison points were identical. The DNA from the 1965 evidence and Leonard Hale's DNA were one and the same. In that moment Holt froze. Every word Mary had written, every line of her sketch, every detail from Hale's old files. It all snapped into a single straight line. A case shrouded in darkness for over 30 years finally had light shining directly on the real perpetrator. Holt set the receiver down, feeling not relief, but the full weight of a truth finally revealed. He immediately began compiling the entire investigation into a complete report. He organized it logically. First, how Mary was found gravely injured, then her description of the attacker, the sketch, the likely route the perpetrator took, the original 1965 suspect list, the appearance of the name Len in Mary's notes, matching that to Hale's residence and employment at the time, the similarities with the 1974 assault, and finally the lab's DNA conclusion. The report included a detailed map of 1960s Milford, with the reconstructed route, a side-by-side photo comparison of Hale in 1974 and the 1965 sketch, and a chart showing how Hale's daily habits matched details Mary had recorded. Holt carefully highlighted every intersection between old and new data points, once dismissed as coincidence, that were now, thanks to DNA, critical evidence. When the file was finished, Holt took it to the county prosecutor's office. The prosecutor read every line, cross-checking each section, lingering longest on the DNA analysis, because at that time, DNA was stronger than any witness statement. Details like the route, the vehicle, the suspect's habits, and the method of the crime only reinforced the name Leonard Hale. Finally, the prosecutor set the report down, let out a long breath, and nodded. "We've got enough." A closed-door meeting was called that same afternoon, attended by Delaware State Police representatives, the cold case unit, the prosecutor, and several seasoned detectives. Everyone agreed the evidence was strong enough to seek an arrest warrant. An emergency arrest warrant for Leonard Hale was drafted and sent to the local judge for approval. No one in the room had any doubt left. The case that once seemed impossible had turned a corner. When the judge's stamp hit the document, the small sound echoed in the quiet room, but to Holt it sounded like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for 30 years. And behind that door was the face of the man who had turned a peaceful night in Milford in 1965 into a nightmare. A face that, it turned out, Mary had described accurately from the very beginning. Leonard Hale's arrest warrant was approved shortly after Holt's report reached the judge. Word spread through Delaware State Police internal channels, and a small tactical team was dispatched to Hale's current residence, a modest single-story house on the outskirts of Bear, Delaware. The house looked quiet and ordinary, but to the team, it held 3 decades of mystery surrounding Mary Ellen Weaver's case. Officers approached with maximum caution. The front yard was still, with only an old pickup truck parked beside it, not the sedan noted in the... When the team leader knocked and read the warrant, Hale appeared in the doorway, his face much older than in the old photos. Though surprised, he didn't resist strongly. He glanced at the warrant for a few seconds, before being cuffed and led to the patrol car. His silence unnerved some of the officers. It was as if he had always known this day would come, just not that it would take 30 years. As soon as Hale was taken away, the search team entered. The house was fairly clean but cluttered, especially a back storage room. Cardboard boxes were stacked high, many yellowed with age. Inside, officers began examining every item, looking for anything that might tie back to the 1965 crime or the car Hale once drove. It didn't take long to find an old photo album. The faded pictures inside mostly showed a younger Hale with friends. Several photos captured him standing next to a gray sedan, exactly the make and model Mary had described, and that matched the bench seat, dark interior, and overall shape were a striking match to the details investigators had reconstructed from Mary's notes. Another officer discovered an old cloth bag containing loose pieces of car carpet. The material and color were so similar that the team immediately recalled the carpet fibers recovered near where Mary was found. Though modern forensic testing wasn't yet available in the 1990s context, the resemblance was powerful supporting evidence. In the living room on the coffee table they seized a metal tin containing personal items Hale had apparently kept for years, a lighter, packs of an old cigarette brand, and a few small objects. The tin itself wasn't direct DNA evidence, but it matched the heavy smoking habit noted in files and the smell Mary had described so clearly. The search continued for older documents, work contracts, bills, vehicle registrations, and even 1960s residency papers. One file folder tucked in a cabinet showed Hale had lived in a boarding house near Mispillion Marsh from 1964-1966. Exactly the time and place that aligned with the reconstructed record. Furthermore, records showed he worked the night shift at a garage just blocks from Mary's home, explaining how he knew the neighborhood layout and could approach her house undetected. Every small detail found in Hale's home strengthened the link to. It wasn't just the DNA and the sketch, old car photos, carpet pieces, smoking habit, former address, and job all lined up layer by layer, as if the past 3 decades had simply been time waiting for the truth to fall into place. When the search concluded, all evidence was sealed and transported to headquarters. Hale was taken to temporary holding to prepare for formal interrogation. On the ride back, Holt looked at the case file he had spent months piecing together, and realized this moment. The suspect officially in custody was the result of years of patience and the trembling words Mary had written from her hospital bed, all those years ago. The case wasn't over, but with Hale in custody and a mountain of corroborating evidence on the table, the path to the truth had never been clearer. Hale was brought to the interrogation room as soon as the search of his home was complete. The small room had harsh white lights, an old metal table, and 2 chairs facing each other. A space deliberately designed to isolate the suspect from the outside world. Hale sat down, red marks still visible on his wrists from the cuffs, his eyes darting as if searching for something in the room to hold on to. There was nothing. Raymond Holt entered, placed the thick case file on the table, and said nothing for several seconds. The silence wasn't meant to pressure Hale. It was to let him understand this wasn't a routine interrogation. This was a confrontation, 30 years in the making. A truth time could not erase. Holt began with the clearest evidence. First, the DNA. He slid the forensic report across the table without elaboration. Every marker matched perfectly between the sample from Mary's 1965 clothing and Hale's sample from the night. Holt didn't say science had caught him, he simply said this was a match no innocent person could reasonably explain. Next, Holt presented photos of items seized from Hale's home. Carpet pieces matching fibers found where Mary was discovered, album photos of the gray sedan Hale once owned, and documents proving he lived near Mispillion Marsh at the exact time of the crime. As if that weren't enough, Holt laid the 1965 composite sketch, the face of a man with a scar at the corner of his mouth, next to a photo of a young Hale. The resemblance made the room feel suddenly colder. Hale didn't react immediately. He glanced at each document, his eyes heavy, like a man backed into a corner with nowhere left to go. A long silence followed. Holt recognized this as the moment Hale was deciding whether to keep denying or face what he knew he couldn't escape. Finally, Hale let out a sigh, an ordinary-sounding sigh, yet it carried the weight of 30 years of buried guilt. He dropped his head, then slowly looked up, staring not at Holt but into the empty space in front of him, as if watching his own memories play back. Hale began to confess. He said that night after leaving a bar, he drove his gray sedan through the Nerduin near Mary's house. He admitted he had been drinking heavily and felt detached from himself. When he saw Mary's bedroom window slightly open, he suddenly decided to go in. He used the word impulsive, but Holt understood it was Hale's way of softening the fact that he had broken in deliberately. Hale described lifting Mary out of bed, covering her mouth with his hand to keep her quiet, and carrying her out of the sleeping house. When she struggled in the car, he forced her to sit on his lap to keep her silent. The smell of beer and cigarettes Mary had described was all accurate. Hale admitted smoking at least half a pack that night, and the stench of beer still clung to him as he drove. When they reached the reeds near Mispillion Marsh, Hale confessed he pulled Mary from the car and assaulted her. When Holt asked why he left her in the marsh instead of taking her elsewhere, Hale didn't answer right away. He swallowed hard, his hands clenching on the table, then finally said he thought the little girl was dead. That wasn't an excuse. It was an admission of the cowardice that had haunted him for 30 years. He abandoned Mary, an 8-year-old child, in the reeds, believing no one would find her alive. Holt didn't interrupt. He let Hale speak, piece by broken piece, until the man across from him was nearly spent. There was no sign Hale was trying to justify himself. He was simply freeing himself from the ghost he had tried to hide for 3 decades. When the confession ended, Holt gathered the pages, the evidence, the files. He offered no closing statement, no judgment. His job was to bring the truth to light, and now the truth lay on the table. Hale was taken back to his cell to await further questioning in the coming days and formal charges. The steel door slammed shut behind him like a period at the end of 30 years of running. But for Holt, it was only the beginning of the next chapter, finding out what else Hale might still be hiding beyond his confession about Mary Ellen Weaver. After the first interrogation, Hale was taken back to his cell, but Holt knew the investigation was far from over, with the confession tied only to Mary Ellen Weaver. The next morning, when Hale was brought back into the interrogation room, something in his face had changed, no longer defiant or guarded, but the weary look of a man who finally realized the secrets he had buried for 3 decades were being peeled away layer by layer. Holt sat down, opened his notebook but asked no questions. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Hale broke it himself with words Holt never expected. "I did it before Mary too." Holt kept his expression neutral, but inside he felt the investigation shift dramatically. Hale lowered his voice, eyes fixed on the cold metal table, and began talking about Linda Carver, a 19-year-old who vanished in 1964, 1 year before Mary. Linda's disappearance had shaken the small community at the time, but no one was ever arrested and no body was ever found. The case quietly faded like so many others from that era. Hale said he spotted Linda as she left her shift at a grocery store near Milford. He followed her down a dimly lit road, forced her into his gray sedan, the same car he used for years, and everything happened fast, just like with Mary. Only in 1964, Linda never had a chance to survive. Hale described taking her to a deserted patch of land on the southern edge of Milford, an area rarely visited back then, and killing her there. When Holt pressed for the exact location, Hale gave a surprisingly detailed description, as if the spot had stayed crystal clear in his mind for 30 years. Holt immediately reported it to his superiors. A search team was mobilized with maps and Hale's account. The area was identified as a piece of land on the border between Milford and Ellendale, once dotted with old abandoned wooden houses. Forensic teams and investigators began surveying, marking spots where the soil looked compacted or the grass grew unevenly, possible signs of disturbance beneath the surface. Within hours of test digging, the team uncovered human bones more than a meter deep in the damp earth. The remains were relatively intact, along with a few scraps of decayed fabric. The location matched Hale's description almost perfectly. The site was immediately sealed off as a crime scene, and excavation proceeded carefully to preserve every piece of evidence. Once the remains reached the forensic lab, experts began the identification process standard for that era, examining bone structure, height, dental characteristics, and comparing them to Linda Carver's medical record. Linda had a distinctive silver filling in one front tooth, a key detail in her dental file. When the jaw was cleaned, that exact feature was found. Height, estimated age, and bone condition all matched perfectly. It wasn't long before the official conclusion came. The remains were those of Linda Carver, missing since night. When Holt returned to the holding cell with the report, Hale showed no surprise that the bones had been found, as if he had never truly believed his crimes could stay buried forever. He simply lowered his head, no resistance, no shock, as though the truth had finally reached a point he could no longer dodge. Holt left the room with a heavy but clear feeling. This investigation had delivered justice not only for Mary Ellen Weaver, but for Linda Carver, a victim forgotten for 30 years. And the case, once thought to revolve only around a bloody 1965 attack, had just revealed a far darker layer. Questions still remained for Holt to answer. Why did Hale stop? Were there others besides Mary and Linda? But one thing was certain. What Hale had confessed was only the surface of a secret Milford had unknowingly lived alongside for decades. The discovery of Linda Carver's remains and Hale's detailed confession pushed the case into a point of no return. The Kent County prosecutor began preparing charges on 2 separate counts: first-degree murder in the 1964 death of Linda Carver and kidnapping, assault, attempted murder in the 1965 attack on Mary Ellen Weaver. When the trial date was set, a file spanning 3 decades finally saw the light of day. Tension filled the Milford courthouse from the very first morning when the prosecutor stood to deliver his opening statement. He did not start with DNA or physical evidence. Instead, he reconstructed the entire investigation from 1965, knowing the jury needed to see both the length and depth of the case to understand how every piece finally pointed to Hale. The prosecutor described Mary Ellen Weaver being found critically injured in Mispillion Marsh, the injuries the doctors documented, and how the little girl, unable to speak, still managed to write notes. Each note was projected on the screen, carried mouth covered, gray car, cigarette smell, beer smell, and most importantly the letters. He recounted the search parties, the tire tracks in the wet dirt, the beer can, cigarette butts, and the piece of car carpet. Evidence collected at the time but impossible to analyze with the tools then available. The jury heard why the case had gone cold. No forensic technology, no automated fingerprint system, no surveillance cameras. Then the prosecutor moved to the turning point, the arrival of DNA RFLP testing, and the early CODIS system in the night. A forensic expert took the stand and walked through the process of extracting DNA from the 1965 evidence. Of the two DNA gels were shown. Every marker lined up perfectly, no discrepancies, no room for error. A quiet ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom when the expert stated the odds of this match occurring in two different people were essentially zero. The prosecutor continued with a 1965 map of Milford, tracing the route the perpetrator took with Mary from the empty windowed house to Mispillion Marsh. They highlighted the rough dirt roads Mary described, the rare yellow streetlights along the route, Hale's residence at the time, sitting right on that path. Next came the comparisons, smelling beer and cigarettes, and seeing a scar on the left side of the mouth, displayed next to the 1965 composite sketch Mary had helped create. The jury could see the clear match. The prosecutor called Holt to the stand. He described Hale's confession in the interrogation room. Then Holt detailed the confession about Linda Carver. Forensic experts confirmed the remains recovered from the southern edge of Milford were indeed Linda's. The jury saw photos of the excavation site, the decayed fabric scraps, and the matching dental records. The 1964 case was no longer speculation, it was hard evidence. Defense counsel tried to argue that Hale's confession had been influenced by interrogation pressure and that age might have distorted his memory. The prosecutor immediately countered, DNA does not depend on memory. Linda's remains did not magically appear exactly where Hale said they would. Mary's sketch did not coincidentally match Hale's scar. As he concluded his presentation, the prosecutor delivered the line that left the courtroom in total silence. For 30 years Hale ran from the truth, but the truth never left that crime scene. We just needed the technology to let it speak. After slightly more than a day of deliberation, the jury returned, faces grave. The four-person stood, guilty, first-degree murder, Linda Carver, 1964. Guilty, kidnapping and attempted murder, Mary Ellen Weaver, 1965. No one in the room looked surprised, except Hale himself, who finally understood that every tiny piece had led straight to him. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. Hale was led out of the courtroom, and the steel door closed behind him, ending the darkest chapter in Milford's history. A chapter that had lasted more than 3 decades, but was finally closed with justice. Leonard Hale's conviction closed a dark chapter that had lasted over 3 decades, but in Milford and across Delaware, the ripples from the case lasted far longer than the years Hale had managed to hide. Immediately after the trial, local and state media covered the story non-stop, calling it a landmark example of the power of modern forensics, proof that science could break through walls that 1960s technology could never climb. For Milford, a small town accustomed to a quiet pace of life, solving the case carried special meaning. The generation that had lived there in 1965, those who had searched the marsh for Mary or stood at their windows watching headlights pass that night, felt like an old wound had finally been stitched closed. Many said they never thought they would see the truth come out, but when DNA identified the perpetrator, they realized this was justice not just for Mary and Linda, but a reminder of how vital it is to document, store and protect evidence. Delaware authorities treated the case as a catalyst for reforming missing person reporting and child-related investigations. Community meetings were held where residents expressed gratitude for the decades-long dedication of investigators. Schools added regular child safety education, stressing how to recognize danger, report anything unusual, and make sure children know how to seek help. For law enforcement, the case became a classic study in cold case unit training across the state. Forensic courses used the actual Mary Ellen Weaver evidence to illustrate the importance of preserving items, even those once considered low value. Holt's methodical review of old files, chasing every faint lead and matching it to new technology, became the textbook example of persistence in long-dormant investigations. On a broader level, the case accelerated DNA database expansion in Delaware. State Police widened DNA collection from past violent assaults and upgraded storage facilities to keep evidence viable for as long as possible. Neighboring states even studied Delaware's handling of the case to improve their own forensic systems. Community healing did not happen overnight. For those who lived in Milford at the time, the case was more than a crime story. It was a collective memory of how fragile safety can be and how resilient hope is. Mary, still alive, still carrying the scars of that night, became a symbol of strength and the ability to rise after tragedy. Linda Carver's family, after decades of not knowing what happened to their daughter, finally had a place to lay flowers and say the goodbye they never got to say. A small ceremony was held in Milford to remember Linda and to honor everyone who had pursued the case for 3 decades. Retired investigators stood beside the newest recruits, looking back on the long road Delaware had traveled. Few words were spoken, but everyone understood that this case had changed how they viewed their work, their community, and time itself. That sometimes justice doesn't disappear. It simply waits for the right moment and the right tools to be set free. When the case finally closed, Milford did not return exactly to what it was before. Instead, the town learned to move forward more cautiously, more united, and with deeper respect for the effort it takes to uncover the truth. To many, the greatest legacy of the Mary Ellen Weaver case was not just bringing the perpetrator to light, but proving that the truth, even when buried for decades, can still be found when community, science, and determination stand together. Looking back at what happened in Milford in 1965, it's easy to think it was just the tragedy of one small town in the past, but it actually touches on very American issues we still face today: child safety, trust in the justice system, the power of science, and the voice of victim. Mary Ellen Weaver, an 8-year-old girl who couldn't speak, left with only a trembling pencil and blank sheets of paper, wrote cigarette smell, beer smell, gray car, the letters length. Those tiny details, combined with police, who carefully kept the beer can, cigarette butts, and carpet scrap for decades, became the foundation that allowed forensic DNA and CODIS, 30 years later, to knock on the exact name, Leonard. The real-world lessons for American life today are clear. First, never dismiss small details. A strange smell, a name, a license plate glimpsed in the night. If something feels wrong, write it down. Tell the police. Those scraps of information could become Mary's notes in a future case. Second, believe in the value of reporting early and preserving evidence long-term. Mary's family called police the moment she was missing. The Milford community searched immediately, and investigators followed procedure and kept the evidence for decades. In today's America, with Amber Alerts, security cameras, sex offender registries, and more, we have to remember the system is only as strong as the citizens who actually use it, who aren't afraid to report, who aren't afraid to be witnesses. Third, the story reminds us to trust in recovery and in victims' voices. Mary didn't just survive, she helped solve the case for Linda Carver too. In everyday life, that means listen to, respect, and never doubt or blame victims of violence. And if you yourself have been through something, remember that your voice, even years later, can still change lives, and even entire community. Thank you for joining us on this journey to revisit the truth after more than half a century. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the cases solved through persistence and the power of forensics. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the stories that make justice speak, no matter how hard time has tried to silence them.